It was supposed to be the proudest night of her career. Margaret Foster stood in her tailored navy suit, adjusting the pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother, ready to deliver her farewell speech after 3 decades of building Foster Dynamics from the ground up. But then something no one expected happened. At the entrance to the grand ballroom, her Rottweiler, Atlas, stood blocking the double doors, his massive body rigid, a deep growl rumbling from his chest as his eyes locked onto the podium where her successor waited. The crowd of 300 executives and shareholders fell silent. "Whose dog is that?" someone whispered from the back tables. But Margaret's assistant gasped, recognizing the distinctive red service vest. "It's hers," she said, her voice trembling. "That's Margaret's therapy dog. Why was he here at the company's anniversary gala acting like this?" And when Atlas suddenly lunged toward the stage, knocking over a champagne tower and sending glass cascading across the marble floor, chaos erupted. Security rushed forward. Cameras flashed. No one understood what was happening. Everyone thought the aging dog had finally lost his senses, until Atlas's instincts revealed a deception so calculated, so deeply buried, that what Margaret discovered in the next hour would not only shatter her legacy, but expose a betrayal that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Stay with us, because what this dog did next will restore your faith and loyalty when everything else fails. And before we begin, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city and state in the comments. I love seeing how these stories of courage and truth reach every corner of the globe. The autumn sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Margaret Foster's penthouse office, casting golden rectangles across the mahogany desk where she'd made the decisions that transformed a struggling manufacturing firm into a Fortune 500 technology powerhouse. Today was different, though. Today she was packing up 30 years of memories into neat cardboard boxes. Atlas lay near her feet, his black and tan coat gleaming in the afternoon light. But his amber eyes hadn't left her face all morning. He was a steady presence. Always had been, since she'd adopted him 9 years ago, after her husband's death. A therapy dog, they'd called him then. Margaret just called him family. "You've been awfully quiet today, boy," she said softly, crouching down to scratch behind his ears. Atlas whined, low and uncertain, pressing his massive head against her palm. His tail didn't wag. That was the first sign, though Margaret didn't recognize it yet. She chalked it up to the disruption in their routine. Dogs sensed change. Everyone knew that. Her nephew, Daniel Foster, appeared in the doorway, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his smile bright and confident. "Aunt Margaret, the event coordinator needs to confirm the seating chart for tonight." Margaret stood, smoothing her skirt. "Tell her, the original arrangement is fine. I want the board members near the stage, investors at the tables by the windows." Daniel nodded, but his gaze flickered toward Atlas, who had risen to his feet. The dog's ears were pinned back slightly, his body tense. "Still bringing him to the gala?" Daniel asked, with a forced chuckle. "You know how some of the board members feel about animals at formal events." "Atlas goes where I go," Margaret said firmly. "He's been with me through every major decision for the past 9 years. He'll be there for my last one." Daniel's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course. I just thought maybe tonight, since it's so important." "Especially tonight," Margaret interrupted gently. "He's part of this journey, Daniel. He deserves to be there when I pass the torch to you." Something in Daniel's expression shifted, just for a fraction of a second. Atlas caught it. The Rottweiler took 2 deliberate steps forward, positioning himself between Margaret and her nephew, his gaze never wavering from Daniel's face. Daniel laughed nervously. "Protective as always, isn't he?" "He's a good judge of character," Margaret said, though she smiled as she said it. "Always has been." After Daniel left, Atlas didn't relax. He paced near the door, occasionally glancing back at Margaret, his breathing slightly elevated. She noticed, but pushed the concern aside. Tonight was too important. The company's 30th anniversary gala, her official retirement, the announcement of Daniel as the new CEO, everything she'd worked for, Everything her late husband had dreamed of was coming to fruition. Nothing could go wrong. But as she returned to packing, Atlas moved to the window and let out a single, sharp bark. A sound that made the hairs on the back of Margaret's neck stand up. A sound she'd only heard twice before, both times when danger was near. The Foster Dynamics headquarters buzzed with activity as evening approached. Catering staff rushed through hallways with silver trays. Florists arranged enormous displays of white orchids and deep red roses. The grand ballroom on the 20th floor had been transformed into something out of a magazine. Crystal chandeliers glittering above round tables draped in ivory silk. Margaret arrived early, Atlas walking calmly beside her despite the chaos. He'd been trained for crowds, for noise, for the unpredictable energy of corporate events. But tonight, something was different. His head swiveled constantly, scanning faces, tracking movements. His nose twitched as they passed the catering stations. When they reached the staging area behind the ballroom, Atlas stopped abruptly. He stared at a closed door labeled, "Private, Executive Use Only." A low rumble started in his chest. "Atlas, come," Margaret commanded gently. The dog didn't move. His eyes were locked on that door, his entire body rigid with focus. Margaret's assistant, Diane, hurried over with a tablet. "Margaret, we need you to review the speech teleprompter one more time." Daniel made a few last-minute additions. "Additions?" Margaret frowned. "I approved the final version yesterday." He said it was just some additional acknowledgments. Nothing major. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "Fine. Let me see it." But as she turned toward the stage entrance, Atlas barked. Sharp, insistent, commanding. Heads turned. Diane jumped. "Atlas, enough," Margaret said more firmly. He barked again, then moved to stand directly in her path, blocking her from entering the ballroom. Several staff members had stopped to stare now. Margaret felt heat rising in her cheeks. This wasn't like him. Atlas was disciplined, well-trained, gentle despite his imposing size. "Maybe he's not feeling well," Diane suggested. "Should we take him home?" "No," Margaret said quietly, kneeling to meet Atlas's eyes. "What's wrong, boy? What are you trying to tell me?" Atlas whined, a sound of pure distress. He looked toward that closed door again, then back at her. Then toward the ballroom where technicians were testing microphones. His meaning was clear, even if his words weren't. "Something here is wrong." Margaret's heart rate quickened. She remembered the other times Atlas had acted this way. Once, when a supposedly friendly business partner had actually been planning corporate espionage, Atlas had growled at the man's briefcase until Margaret investigated and found hidden recording devices. Another time, when a supposedly routine building inspection turned out to be a cover for a competitor trying to steal proprietary designs, Atlas had refused to let the inspectors pass the lobby. Both times, she'd trusted him. Both times, he'd been right. "Show me," she whispered. Atlas turned immediately, leading her away from the crowd, back toward that private door. He sat in front of it, his gaze fixed on the handle. Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her master key. Inside, the room was dark except for emergency lighting. It was a small executive lounge, rarely used, filled with leather chairs and a mahogany bar. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Then Atlas moved to the bar and placed his paw on a black leather messenger bag tucked beneath it. Margaret pulled out the bag and opened it. Inside were file folders, a laptop, and a small, clear bottle filled with white powder, labeled only with a piece of masking tape that read 0.5 milligrams per 200 milliliters. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't medication. This wasn't anything that belonged in an executive lounge. And the initials on the leather bag? DF. Daniel Foster. Atlas sat beside her, completely still now, watching her face as understanding began to dawn. Margaret's hands shook as she held the small bottle up to the dim light. The powder inside shifted like fine sand. Her mind raced through possibilities. None of them good. Atlas remained beside her, his breathing steady and calm now that she'd found what he'd been trying to show her. She set the bottle carefully on the bar, and opened the laptop inside Daniel's bag. It powered on without needing a password, the screen illuminating her shocked face. What she saw made her stomach drop. Spreadsheet after spreadsheet of offshore accounts, transfers of company funds dating back 3 years, amounts that made her head spin. $50,000 here, $120,000 there, culminating in a massive $2.3 million transfer scheduled for tomorrow morning, right after the official transition of power would be complete. "Oh, Daniel," she whispered. "What have you done?" Atlas nudged her hand gently, reminding her they weren't alone for long. The gala would begin in 40 minutes. She needed to think, needed to act, needed to understand the full scope of what was happening. She took photos of the laptop screen with her phone, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Then she saw another folder, this one labeled Transition Plan, Confidential. Inside were medical reports. Her medical reports. Records from her annual physical, her cholesterol screenings, even notes from her therapist after her husband's death, all of it marked up with Daniel's handwritten notes. Declining cognitive function, early signs of dementia, board concerns about competency. Margaret's breath caught. Daniel had been building a narrative, making people question her mental sharpness, planting seeds of doubt about whether she was still fit to lead, even as she prepared to step down. But why? She was already retiring. She was already handing him everything. Unless she returned to the mysterious bottle, 0.5 milligrams per 200 milliliters. Her scientific background kicked in. She pulled out her phone and searched the concentration ratio. Within seconds, she had her answer, and it felt like ice water in her veins. Benzodiazepine powder. In that concentration, dissolved in liquid, it would cause confusion, slurred speech, disorientation, symptoms that would look exactly like dementia or a stroke. To an untrained observer, the plan crystallized in her mind with horrifying clarity. Daniel was going to drug her speech tonight, in front of 300 witnesses, board members, investors, and the media. Margaret Foster would appear to be suffering from severe cognitive decline. It would be her last public appearance, and it would be a disaster. Her legacy would be tarnished. Questions about her competency would seem validated, and most importantly, it would cast doubt on every decision she'd made in her final years as CEO, including the financial audits she'd recently approved, audits that would have discovered Daniel's embezzlement. Atlas barked once, sharp and urgent. Footsteps were approaching in the hallway outside. Margaret quickly zipped the bag shut and shoved it back under the bar exactly where Atlas had found it. She grabbed the bottle of powder and slipped it into her jacket pocket just as the door opened. Daniel stood there, backlit by the bright hallway. "Aunt Margaret?" He sounded surprised. "What are you doing in here?" She forced her expression to remain neutral, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Atlas moved to stand between them, his body language protective but not overtly aggressive. "Not yet." Atlas was acting strangely, she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "I thought he might need a quiet moment before the chaos begins." Daniel's eyes flickered to the bar, to the spot where his bag sat hidden. "And does he feel better now?" "I think he was trying to tell me something," Margaret said carefully. "He's very perceptive, you know. He always knows when something isn't right." Daniel's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, we should get you to the staging area. Your guests are starting to arrive." "Of course." Margaret moved toward the door, but Atlas didn't follow immediately. The dog stared at Daniel with an intensity that made the younger man step aside. "He really doesn't seem to like me much tonight," Daniel said with a forced laugh. "Maybe he knows you're about to take his favorite person away from him," Margaret replied. "Dogs understand more than we give them credit for." They walked back toward the ballroom, Margaret's mind racing with what to do next. She couldn't just confront Daniel. Not without solid proof and witnesses. She couldn't just cancel the event, not after months of planning, and with so many people already arriving. And she couldn't let Daniel anywhere near her speech, her drink, or anything she might consume. Atlas stayed glued to her side, his presence a solid comfort in the midst of her spiraling thoughts. As they approached the ballroom entrance, she could hear the string quartet playing softly, the murmur of conversation and laughter. Through the doorway, she saw the podium where she would stand in less than an hour, where Daniel expected her to humiliate herself, to destroy everything she'd built. But Margaret Foster hadn't become a Fortune 500 CEO by letting others write her story. And with Atlas beside her, she wasn't going to start now. The ballroom filled quickly with the city's business elite. Men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns clustered around cocktail tables, champagne flutes catching the light from the crystal chandeliers above. Photographers from business journals mingled with the crowd, and a local news crew set up cameras near the stage. Margaret stood in a small room off the main ballroom, supposedly reviewing her speech notes. But her attention kept returning to the vial of powder in her pocket. Atlas lay at her feet, calmer now but still vigilant. Diane knocked softly and entered. 5 minutes until you're introduced. Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee? Water would be perfect, Margaret said. Then, as Diane turned to leave, she added, But Diane, could you bring it yourself? And make sure you watch them pour it? Diane's eyebrows raised slightly. Is everything okay? Just being cautious, Margaret said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It's been a long day. After Diane left, Margaret pulled out her phone and opened her security app. Foster Dynamics had cameras throughout the building, including in all executive areas. She scrolled back through the footage from the private lounge, her heart sinking as she watched Daniel enter alone 2 hours earlier, place his bag under the bar, and leave quickly. Then, 30 minutes before Margaret had arrived with Atlas, she saw him return. This time, he carried something small in his hand. The footage was grainy, but she could make out enough. Daniel approached the staging area, slipped into the room where her prepared glass of water sat waiting, and poured something from a small vial into it. He swirled the glass gently until whatever he'd added dissolved completely. Then he set it back on the tray and left. Margaret's hands clenched around her phone. She had him. The evidence was there, digital and time-stamped. But confronting him now, in front of everyone, would still cause a scandal. The company's stock would plummet. The anniversary celebration would become a nightmare. 30 years of careful reputation building could unravel in minutes. Atlas lifted his head and looked at her with those knowing amber eyes. In that moment, Margaret understood something fundamental. Atlas hadn't been trying to stop the event. He'd been trying to protect her from drinking whatever Daniel had prepared. The dog couldn't tell her about the evidence, couldn't explain the embezzlement scheme, couldn't reveal the conspiracy, but he could keep her away from that poisoned glass. Diane returned with a sealed bottle of water, unopened. Watch them get it from the case myself, she said. Thank you. Margaret broke the seal and took a long drink, her mind clicking through her options like a chess player seeing 20 moves ahead. She opened her laptop and began typing rapidly, modifying her speech. If Daniel wanted a show, she'd give him one, just not the one he was expecting. The events coordinator appeared at the door. Mrs. Foster, we're ready for you. Margaret stood, straightening her jacket. Atlas rose with her, his movements precise and controlled. He's coming with me, she said. But he's coming, Margaret repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. She walked through the curtain and into the ballroom, with Atlas at her side. The crowd hushed as spotlights illuminated her path to the podium. She could see Daniel at a front table, his expression confident, expectant. He raised his glass to her in a small toast, probably thinking about the glass of prepared water waiting at the podium. Margaret reached the stage and looked at the podium. There it was, the glass of water, sitting innocuously on the shelf below the microphone. She didn't touch it. Instead, she pulled out her own water bottle and set it beside her laptop. The crowd settled into their seats. Atlas positioned himself at the base of the stage steps, his eyes never leaving Daniel. Good evening, Margaret began, her voice strong and clear. 30 years ago, my husband and I started this company in a garage, with nothing but an idea and an unfounded optimism. Polite laughter rippled through the room. Margaret continued with the opening of her planned speech, hitting all the expected notes. She thanked key employees, acknowledged board members, reflected on challenges overcome, and victories celebrated. The audience was engaged, comfortable. Daniel was starting to look confused. Why wasn't she drinking the water? Margaret took a sip from her own bottle and saw him lean forward slightly, tense. Then she deviated from the script. But tonight, I want to talk about something more important than business success. I want to talk about trust. The tone in the room shifted subtly. People sat up straighter. When you build a company, you're not just building a product or a service. You're building relationships, and those relationships are only as strong as the trust that underlies them. She clicked to a new slide, one that wasn't in the original presentation. It showed the Foster Dynamics logo, but beneath it was a quote, "Trust is earned in drops and lost in buckets. My therapy dog Atlas has taught me more about trust than any business school ever could." Margaret continued, gesturing to where the Rottweiler sat watchful and alert. Dogs don't care about your title or your bank account. They care about your character, and they have an uncanny ability to sense when something isn't right. Daniel's face had gone pale. Several board members were looking at him now, noticing his reaction. "For instance," Margaret said, her voice taking on a steel edge, "Atlas has been trying to tell me something all day. He's been agitated, protective, insistent, and I've learned over 9 years that when Atlas warns me about something, I should listen." She clicked to another slide. This one showed a photo of the private lounge, time-stamped from her earlier investigation. "This afternoon, Atlas led me to a messenger bag in one of our executive lounges. Inside that bag, I found something very disturbing. The room was utterly silent now. You could have heard a pin drop. I found evidence of systematic embezzlement from Foster Dynamics, totaling over $3 million over the past 3 years. Gasps erupted. Chairs scraped. Daniel stood abruptly, his face flushed. "Aunt Margaret, what are you?" "Sit down, Daniel," she said quietly, but her voice carried through the microphone with absolute authority. He sat, but his jaw was clenched, his hands gripping the table edge. Margaret continued, "I also found a concerning substance." She pulled the vial from her pocket and held it up. "Medical-grade benzodiazepine, in a concentration designed to cause confusion and disorientation. And thanks to our building's security cameras, I have footage of someone adding this substance to the glass of water that was prepared for me tonight." She gestured to the untouched glass at the podium, "The same person whose bag I found this afternoon." The room exploded. Board members were on their feet. Security was moving. Daniel tried to stand again, to run, but 2 security officers were already at his table. Atlas rose to his feet, a low growl rumbling through his chest that somehow carried above the chaos. "The plan, I believe," Margaret said, her voice cutting through the noise, "was for me to drink that water, to appear confused and incompetent during my farewell speech, to humiliate myself in front of everyone who matters, and in doing so, to cast doubt on my recent decisions as CEO, particularly my approval of new financial audits that would have uncovered the embezzlement." She looked directly at Daniel, who had slumped in his chair, his face ashen. "What I don't understand, Daniel, is why. I was already stepping down. I was already giving you everything. Why wasn't that enough?" But even as she asked, she knew the answer. The audits, the careful systems of checks and balances she'd put in place. Daniel needed her to look incompetent, so those systems would seem unreliable too. He needed her legacy questioned, so his crimes would stay buried. Atlas barked once, sharp and final. Police officers were entering the ballroom now, called by security. The news cameras that were supposed to capture a heartwarming retirement speech were instead recording a corporate crime being exposed in real time. One of the officers approached the stage. "Mrs. Foster, we'll need that vial and the glass as evidence." "Of course," she said, handing both over carefully. "I have the security footage queued up on my laptop as well, along with financial records found in the suspect's belongings." Daniel was being escorted out now, handcuffed, his head down. As he passed the stage, he looked up at Margaret one last time. I just needed more time, he said, his voice breaking. The investments went bad, and I thought I could fix it before anyone noticed. I never wanted to hurt you. But you were willing to destroy me to save yourself, Margaret replied quietly. That's not business, Daniel. That's betrayal. He had no answer for that. They led him away. The ballroom had descended into controlled chaos. Board members huddled in urgent conversations. Lawyers appeared seemingly from nowhere, already on their phones. The news cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of what would undoubtedly be the business scandal of the year. Margaret stood at the podium, suddenly feeling every one of her 62 years. She looked down at Atlas, who had climbed the stage steps, and now sat beside her, his massive head level with her hip. She rested her hand on his broad skull, drawing strength from his solid, unwavering presence. Ladies and gentlemen, she said into the microphone, and surprisingly, the room quieted again. I apologize that tonight's celebration has taken this unfortunate turn. However, I want you all to know something important. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Some shocked, some concerned, some already calculating the business implications. Foster Dynamics was built on integrity. My husband and I founded this company with the belief that success without ethics is just another word for theft. What happened here tonight, what my nephew attempted, was a betrayal of those values, but it was also a reminder of why those values matter. Her voice grew stronger. Because of the systems we've had in place, systems designed to ensure transparency and accountability, this fraud would have been discovered regardless. The audits would have caught it. The checks and balances would have worked. But those systems might have taken weeks or months. She looked down at Atlas. This dog, this loyal companion, caught it in hours, not because he can read spreadsheets or understand corporate finance, but because he can read people. He sensed something wrong and refused to let me walk into danger. That's trust. That's loyalty. That's the kind of relationship we should be building in business and in life. Someone in the crowd started clapping, then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was applauding, not for her business acumen or her speech, but for the simple truth she'd spoken. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. I want to be clear about something else, she continued once the applause died down. My retirement stands. I'm stepping down as planned, but I'm recommending to the board that we conduct a thorough search for new leadership rather than rushing to promote from within. We need someone we can trust completely. Someone whose ethics are beyond question. The board chairman stood. We'll convene an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. But Margaret, I think I speak for everyone here when I say, thank you. For your leadership, for your integrity, and for not letting this poison the company you built. More applause. Margaret nodded in acknowledgement, then stepped away from the microphone. Diane appeared at her elbow with a warm shawl. Let's get you out of here, she said gently. They slipped out a side exit, Atlas leading the way as if he'd been planning their escape route all along. Outside, the night air was cool and clean. Margaret stood on the building's private terrace, looking out over the city lights. Atlas sat beside her, finally relaxed, now that the threat had passed. You saved me, she whispered to him. Not just tonight, but my reputation, my legacy, everything that matters. Atlas leaned against her leg, his weight solid and comforting. In the distance, sirens wailed as more police arrived. Inside, investigators would be seizing computers, interviewing witnesses, beginning the long process of unraveling Daniel's crimes. Margaret's phone buzzed constantly with calls and texts, but she ignored them all. Right now, in this moment, it was just her and the dog, who had seen the truth when everyone else had been blind. You know what's funny? She said softly. I almost didn't bring you tonight. Daniel suggested I leave you home. Said it would be more professional if I'd listened to him. She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Atlas turned his head to look at her, and in his amber eyes, she saw understanding. Dogs didn't hold grudges. They didn't plot revenge. They simply protected the ones they loved, with every fiber of their being. without hesitation and without reward. "We make a good team," Margaret said, scratching behind his ears the way he loved. Atlas's tail thumped against the terrace floor, and for the first time all day, he looked truly at peace. The days that followed felt like living through a hurricane. The story broke across every major news outlet within hours. "Retirement Gala becomes crime scene," read one headline. "Therapy dog exposes CEO's embezzlement plot," declared another. Margaret's phone never stopped ringing. Lawyers, investigators, reporters, concerned shareholders, everyone wanted a statement, an interview, an explanation. But Margaret retreated to her home, a modest Victorian in a quiet neighborhood, and let her legal team handle the external chaos. Inside, life was surprisingly peaceful. Atlas followed her from room to room as she finally allowed herself to process what had happened. Daniel had been released on bail pending trial. His assets frozen, his reputation destroyed. The full extent of his crimes was still being uncovered, but preliminary investigations suggested he'd started small, convinced he could pay it back before anyone noticed. Then the investments he'd made with stolen funds had failed, and he'd stolen more to cover the losses, spiraling deeper into a hole he couldn't escape. He was desperate. Margaret told Atlas one morning as they sat on the back porch, watching the sun rise through autumn leaves. But desperation doesn't justify what he tried to do. Atlas rested his chin on her knee, and she stroked his head thoughtfully. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself, but how long it had gone unnoticed. Daniel had been family. She'd trusted him, mentored him, built her succession plan around him, and for 3 years, he'd been stealing from the company she'd poured her life into. "But you saw it," she said to Atlas. "Somehow, you knew something was wrong with him." She'd been researching since that night, reading studies about canine intuition and threat detection. Scientists still couldn't fully explain it. Some theories suggested dogs could smell chemical changes in human sweat when people were lying or anxious. Others pointed to subtle body language cues, invisible to human observers. Whatever the mechanism, the results were undeniable. Atlas had sensed danger when no one else had. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she could see Diane standing on the porch, holding a large envelope. Margaret let her in, and they sat at the kitchen table. "The board wanted me to deliver this personally," Diane said, sliding the envelope across. Inside were letters from every board member, each one expressing gratitude, respect, and support. One, from the board chairman, included a formal resolution. She read it aloud. "Be it resolved that Margaret Foster's legacy at Foster Dynamics is one of unparalleled integrity and leadership. Her actions on the night of October 15th demonstrated the very principles she instilled in this company: transparency, accountability, and an unwavering commitment to truth. Further resolved that the annual Leadership Award shall henceforth be renamed the Margaret Foster Integrity Award, and that a statue of Atlas, the therapy dog, whose instincts protected both Mrs. Foster and the company itself, shall be erected in the headquarters lobby as a reminder that vigilance comes in many forms." Margaret's hands trembled as she set the letter down. "They want to put up a statue of Atlas?" Diane smiled, tears in her eyes. "He's become something of a legend. People are calling him the watchdog of Foster Dynamics. There's even a hashtag trending about trusting your instincts and listening to those who care about you." Atlas, hearing his name repeatedly, padded over and put his head in Margaret's lap. She laughed through her tears, ruffling his ears. "What do you think, boy? Want to be immortalized in bronze?" That afternoon, Margaret did something she hadn't done in 30 years. She went for a walk in the park with no schedule, no agenda, no business calls to return. Just her and Atlas, enjoying the fall colors and the crisp air. Children playing recognized Atlas from the news and asked if they could pet the hero dog. Margaret smiled and agreed, watching as Atlas patiently endured their enthusiastic attention. His tail wagging gently, an elderly woman approached as the children ran off. "You're that CEO, aren't you? The one with the dog?" Margaret nodded. "I am. I had a dog once who saved my life," the woman said. Woke me up in the middle of the night when there was a gas leak. I always told people that dogs are angels in disguise, but no one believed me. She smiled at Atlas. Maybe they'll believe now. After she left, Margaret sat on a park bench and looked at Atlas, who was surveying the playground with calm dignity. She's right, you know, Margaret said. I spent 30 years thinking success was about strategy, market analysis, and smart decisions. But maybe the smartest decision I ever made was trusting you. Not just your training, but your heart. Atlas turned to look at her, and in that moment, Margaret felt a profound shift in her understanding of what mattered. Not the company, not the legacy, not the wealth or prestige, but this, the connection between two beings who loved each other enough to protect one another from harm. We're going to be okay, she told him, and she knew it was true. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the Foster Dynamics lobby, her hand resting on the shoulder of Diane, who had become not just her assistant but her friend, through the chaos. Before them stood a bronze statue, just unveiled, of Atlas in his service vest, sitting alert and watchful, his eyes seeming to gaze protectively over everyone who entered the building. Daniel's trial had concluded the week before, guilty on 15 counts of embezzlement, fraud, and attempted assault. He'd received a 7-year sentence and would be required to make full restitution. Margaret had attended the sentencing but hadn't spoken to him. Some betrayals were too deep for words. The new CEO, a woman named Patricia Chen who'd been vetted more thoroughly than anyone in corporate history, approached with a warm smile. Mrs. Foster, would you like to say a few words? Margaret hadn't planned to speak, but looking at that statue, at the gathered employees and press, she found she had something to say after all. When we think about heroism in business, she began, we usually think of bold decisions, market disruptions, innovative products. But real heroism is simpler and harder. It's about integrity when no one is watching. It's about loyalty when it costs you something. It's about speaking up when staying silent would be easier. She placed her hand on the bronze head of the statue. Atlas didn't expose Daniel's crimes because he understood finance or law. He did it because he understood character. He sensed something wrong and refused to stay quiet, even when everyone around him wanted him to stop barking, to go away, to let the evening proceed as planned. Her voice grew thick with emotion. How many times in our lives do we ignore the warning signs? How many times do we silence the voices, whether human or animal, that try to tell us something's wrong? We call it being professional, or not making waves, or giving people the benefit of the doubt. But sometimes, what we call courtesy is just cowardice, and what looks like loyalty is actually enabling. She looked out at the crowd. I'm grateful to Atlas for many things, for his companionship during lonely years, for his comfort during difficult decisions. But most of all, I'm grateful that he loved me enough to be loud, to be disruptive, to be inconvenient when my safety required it. That's not just a good dog. That's a role model for all of us. The crowd applauded. Someone in the back shouted, "Where's the real Atlas?" Margaret smiled and gestured to where Atlas sat beside her, now 10 years old and sporting a few more gray hairs around his muzzle. Right here. As always, they lined up after the ceremony to take photos with both the bronze Atlas and the real one. Margaret watched as employee after employee knelt beside her dog, whispering thanks, sharing stories of their own pets who'd protected them, promising to listen more carefully to the warnings they'd once ignored. That evening, back home, Margaret sat at her desk, not to work, but to write. She was authoring a memoir, at the insistence of a publisher who'd promised that her story could help others recognize and resist corporate corruption. But as she typed, she realized the book wasn't really about business at all. It was about trust, about how we build it, how we break it, and how sometimes the most trustworthy relationships in our lives have 4 legs and a tail. Atlas slept at her feet, his breathing deep and even. Every so often he'd twitch in his sleep, chasing something in his dreams. Margaret hoped they were good dreams, happy dreams, dreams where the danger had passed and all that remained was sunshine and peace. "Thank you," she whispered to him, not for the first time, and not for the last. For everything. The dog didn't wake, but his tail thumped twice against the floor, as if, even in sleep, he heard her and wanted her to know he'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Margaret closed her laptop and walked to the window. The neighborhood was quiet, houses glowing with warm light in the deepening dusk. She thought about Daniel, about the young man she'd known who'd loved her cookies at Christmas and had asked such thoughtful questions about business strategy. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost himself, chosen expediency over ethics, believed the ends justified the means. She wondered if he'd ever truly understand what he'd sacrificed, not just his freedom or his career, but something more fundamental: trust. Once broken, it could never be fully restored. She thought about all the times Atlas had tried to warn her over the years, and all the times she'd almost ignored him because human logic told her everything was fine. That was the insidious thing about betrayal. It relied on victims talking themselves out of their own instincts. He's family, so he couldn't possibly. It's probably nothing. I'm being paranoid. But instincts existed for a reason. They were the accumulated wisdom of millions of years of evolution, the part of us that noticed danger before our conscious minds caught up. And dogs, unburdened by social niceties and political calculations, listened to those instincts without hesitation. Atlas stirred and padded over to stand beside her at the window. Margaret wrapped her arm around his broad shoulders, and they stood together in companionable silence as the stars emerged overhead. "You know what I learned?" she said softly. "Success isn't about never making mistakes. It's about surrounding yourself with people, or dogs, who'll tell you when you're about to make one, and then having the humility to listen." Her phone buzzed with a text from Patricia, the new CEO. "Board meeting went well. We approved the ethics training program you suggested. Also, we're creating an employee hotline modeled after your Atlas protocol concept. If something feels wrong, speak up immediately, no matter how small it seems. Thank you for leaving us not just a company, but a conscience." Margaret smiled and showed the message to Atlas, as if he could read it. "See that, boy? You started something. A whole new way of doing business. One where we don't wait for obvious fraud or blatant corruption. We trust our instincts. We listen to warnings. We protect each other." Atlas wagged his tail and licked her hand, his rough tongue a familiar comfort. Over the following weeks, Margaret received letters from people around the world. A woman in Seattle whose cat had repeatedly knocked over a cleaning product, leading her to discover it was toxic and had been recalled. A man in Boston whose dog had refused to let him drive, prompting him to get checked out only to discover he was having a silent heart attack. A teenager in Phoenix whose parrot had squawked "bad man" every time her sister's boyfriend came over, leading the family to investigate and discover he was wanted in another state for assault. Everyone had a story about an animal who'd seen what humans had missed. "We're not so different, you and I," Margaret said to Atlas one morning, as they shared breakfast. "You see the world as it is, not as you wish it would be. That's a gift." She'd been asked to speak at business schools, at corporate conferences, at leadership seminars. Everyone wanted to know how she'd built such a successful company, how she'd maintained integrity in a cutthroat industry, how she'd uncovered the fraud. But her answer was always the same, and it always surprised them. "I listened to my dog." Simple, profound, true. Because at the end of the day, after all the analysis and strategy and careful planning, the thing that had saved her wasn't her business acumen. It was her willingness to trust a relationship built not on profit or power, but on pure, uncomplicated love. "You didn't save me from a poisoned drink," Margaret told Atlas during their evening walk, watching the autumn leaves scatter in the breeze. "You saved me from losing faith in goodness, because if someone like you exists, someone so loyal and true and brave, then the world can't be all bad. There's still something worth protecting." Atlas looked up at her with those amber eyes that had seen her through the darkest days after her husband's death, through lonely business trips and difficult decisions, through betrayal and triumph and everything in between. And in his gaze, Margaret saw reflected back the simple truth that had sustained her all along. Love, real love, doesn't need words. It needs only the courage to stand between your beloved and danger, to bark when others want silence, to refuse to move when moving would mean surrender. That was the legacy she wanted to leave. Not the Fortune 500 company, or the business awards, or the financial success, but this: the understanding that sometimes the most important voice in the room is the one that can't speak at all, and the wisdom to listen anyway. As they walked home under the streetlights, Atlas's leash loose in her hand, Margaret whispered a prayer of gratitude, not to some distant deity, but to the universe that had seen fit to put this particular dog in her particular path at exactly the right moment. Because heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear service vests and walk on four legs, and sometimes they save not just your life, but your soul. That night, as Atlas settled into his bed beside hers, Margaret reached down to stroke his head one last time before sleep. "Sweet dreams, my guardian," she whispered. "My protector, my friend, my hero." And in the darkness, she heard the soft thump of his tail against the floor, a sound that said more clearly than any words ever could, "I'll always be here. I'll always keep you safe." Because that's what love does.